Imagine you are walking through the middle of a London street in the year 1300. Above you, the timber-framed houses lean so far across the road that they almost touch, blocking out the sun and leaving you in a damp twilight. You smell the stinging scent of wood smoke and the pungent tang of unwashed wool. To your modern eyes, this world looks like total chaos, a lawless maze of mud and shadow. But as you watch a neighbor bank their hearth fire, you are witnessing a complex web of survival. The rules governing your life here might sound absurd today, like the laws dictating how far a window must sit from the street or who can carry a candle after dark. Yet, in a world made of dry wood and thatch, these strange commands were the only things keeping your city from turning into a funeral pyre. Imagine stepping out of your front door tonight, but instead of the familiar glow of LED streetlights and the steady hum of a distant highway, you are met with a darkness so profound it feels like a physical weight against your chest. Your boots do not click on smooth pavement. Instead, they sink into a thick, cool sludge of mud, straw, and things you would rather not identify. You are standing in the middle of a bustling city in the middle of the 14th century, and the world you knew has been replaced by a landscape that feels fundamentally alien. To your modern eyes, this place looks like a disaster waiting to happen. The houses lean toward each other across the narrow alleyways like gossiping giants, their timber-framed upper floors reaching out until they almost touch the houses on the opposite side. This creates a permanent tunnel of gray twilight even at midday, but now, in the deep of night, it is a labyrinth of shadows. You smell things you have never encountered in your sanitized modern life. It is not just the waste of thousands of people and animals. It is the thick, heavy scent of wood smoke from 1,000 hearths hanging low in the humid air. It is the pungent aroma of raw wool being processed with fermented urine, the sharp, metallic tang of the blacksmith shop 3 doors down, and the sweet, cloying scent of fresh hay in the stables. You feel exposed, yet also strangely cramped. There are no emergency exits here. There are no fire hydrants at every corner. There is number 911 to call when things go wrong. In this world, the rules you live by are not just suggestions or social niceties. They are the fragile threads holding a precarious society together. When we look back from our world of glass and steel, we see laws that look absurd, even cruel. We see rules about who can wear what color of silk, how many people must scream if a crime is committed, or exactly when you are required to put out your own stove. But if you want to survive the next 24 hours in this city, you need to understand that every single one of those bizarre commands was born from a very real, very terrifying necessity. The chaos of this world is only kept at bay by a common sense that we have long since forgotten because we no longer live in a world made of dry wood and prayers. Consider the rule that usually tops the list of medieval eccentricities, the curfew. Today, we think of a curfew as something a frustrated parent gives a teenager or a measure used by a government during a time of civil unrest. But in the medieval world, the word curfew had a literal, physical meaning that had everything to do with survival. The word comes from the French phrase couvre-feu, which means cover fire. As you stand in this dark alley, imagine the sound of a massive bronze bell beginning to toll from the central cathedral or the town hall. This is not a call to prayer. This is the signal that the day is officially over. For you, it means you must go inside, and more importantly, you must cover your hearth with a metal lid or rake the ashes over the embers to extinguish the flames. Why would the government care if you want to stay up late by your own fire? To us, it feels like an overreach of power. But look around you. Your house is made of oak beams and wattle and daub, which is essentially dried mud and straw. Your roof is thick, dry thatch. Your neighbors' houses are exactly the same, and they are so close that you can hear the man next door snoring through the wall. In a world without fire departments, a single spark from a neglected hearth at 3 in the morning could turn a city of 30,000 people into a funeral pyre before the sun rises. The curfew was not about controlling your social life. It was a collective insurance policy. By forcing everyone to extinguish their fires at the same time, the community ensured that no one would fall asleep and let a log roll out onto a rush-covered floor. When you hear that bell, you do not feel oppressed. You feel a sense of relief, knowing that the people living on either side of you are also covering their fires, ensuring that you will likely wake up in the morning. As you walk further into the city, you might hear a sudden, piercing scream. Someone has had their purse cut or been struck in a dark corner. In our world, your instinct might be to stay quiet, stay safe, and call the police from a distance. But in the medieval world, you have a legal, mandatory obligation called the hue and cry. If you witness a crime or are the victim of one, you are required by law to raise your voice and shout as loud as you possibly can. You must cry out to the heavens, and here is the part that seems weird to us. Every person who hears you is legally obligated to drop what they are doing and join the chase. If you are a baker kneading dough, you must drop the flour and run. If you are a cobbler with a half-finished shoe, you must sprint into the street. Then there is the matter of what you eat and where. You might see a man being hauled through the streets on a wooden hurdle, a type of sled, with a loaf of bread tied around his neck while the crowd jeers at him. This looks like a bizarre and cruel public shaming ritual. But this man is a baker who was caught selling bread that was underweight or filled with ash and sand to bulk it up. This falls under the assize of bread and ale. In an age where most people lived on the edge of subsistence, food fraud was not just a white-collar crime. It was a death sentence for the poor. Because there were no nutritional labels or government inspectors from a central agency, the local community created incredibly strict, almost obsessive rules about the weight, quality, and price of basic goods. They would even regulate how much a gallon of ale should cost based on the price of grain that year. It seems like a strange level of micromanagement until you realize that if the price of bread rose by even a few pennies without a good reason, families would starve. The public shaming, the dragging of the baker through the mud, was a way to restore the social contract. It sent a message that in this tightly packed, interdependent world, you cannot profit by hurting your neighbor. The weirdness of the punishment reflected the vital importance of the rule. Even the clothes on your back are governed by rules that seem vain and ridiculous to a modern observer. These were the sumptuary laws, which dictated exactly what fabrics, colors, and furs you could wear based on your social rank. You might think it is a matter of pure snobbery, a way for the elites to keep the peasants in their place. While there was certainly an element of that, there was also a very practical reason for these rules in a world of strangers. In a medieval city, you needed to know exactly who you were dealing with at a glance. Is that man coming toward you a nobleman with the power of high justice, a merchant you can trade with, or a servant on an errand? In a world without identification cards, licenses, or digital footprints, your clothes were your identity. They told the world your status, your profession, and your legal rights. If a commoner wore the silk and purple dye of a king, it was seen as a form of identity theft or fraud. It disrupted the social order because people did not know how to interact with one another. It was weird to have a law about the length of the toes on your shoes or the type of fur on your collar, but in a crowded, illiterate society, visual shorthand was the only way to maintain a functioning social hierarchy. The more you walk through this medieval city, the more you realize that the chaos you perceived at first is actually a highly tuned machine of survival. Every rule, no matter how strange it sounds to someone who has a smartphone and a fire extinguisher, was a direct response to a specific danger. These people were not stupid. They were not obsessed with pointless rituals. They were intensely practical. They lived in a world where the margin for error was razor thin, and their laws reflected that reality. They understood that context is everything. To understand the rule, you have to understand the risk it was meant to prevent. As you stand there in the dark, listening to the final echoes of the curfew bell and the distant bark of a dog, the world starts to make a little more sense. The weirdness begins to fade, and in its place you see a community of people doing the only thing they could to keep the darkness at bay. They were building a world of order out of the raw materials of necessity, and those strange commands were the only things keeping the city alive for one more night. You are walking down a crowded street in London in the middle of the 14th century. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acidic tang of the tanneries near the river. Around you, the city is a riot of noise and movement. Merchants are shouting their prices, cartwheels are clattering over uneven stones, and dogs are barking at the heels of horses. But in this chaos, there is a very specific type of order, one that you can read just by looking at the people passing you by. You do not need to ask a man his name or his trade to know exactly where he stands in the world. You simply look at his sleeves. You look at the fabric of his tunic. You look at the length of his shoes. If you see a man draped in deep crimson velvet with sleeves that trail on the ground like wings, you step aside. You bow your head. You know, without a shadow of a doubt, that he is a member of the high nobility. If you see a woman in a simple kirtle of coarse, undyed wool, her hair covered by a plain linen wimple, you know she is a servant or a laborer. In your world, fashion is an expression of personality. In their world, fashion was a legal requirement. These were the sumptuary laws, and they were some of the most strictly detailed and frequently debated rules of the Middle Ages. To us, the idea that the government could tell you what kind of hat you are allowed to wear seems like the ultimate form of petty tyranny. It feels like a king playing dress-up with his subjects. But if you look closer at the shifting social tides of the time, you begin to see that these laws were not just about vanity. They were a desperate attempt to keep a changing world from spinning out of control. Imagine for a moment that the entire universe is a giant ladder. At the very top is the divine, and at the bottom are the rocks and the dirt. Every living thing has a specific rung on that ladder. This was the great chain of being. To the medieval mind, social stability depended on everyone staying on their assigned rung. If a merchant started acting like a knight, or if a peasant started looking like a lord, the ladder began to shake. And in the 14th century, the ladder was shaking violently. The Black Death had just swept through Europe, killing nearly half the population. This was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, but for the survivors, it created a strange new reality. Suddenly, there was a labor shortage. Peasants who had been tied to the land for generations found that their labor was now a valuable commodity. They could demand higher wages. They could move to the city. For the first time in history, the lower classes had silver in their pockets. And what do people do when they suddenly have a little bit of extra money? They want to show it off. They want to buy things that make them feel successful. They want the fine Italian silks. They want the furs brought in from the Baltic. They want the bright, expensive dyes that were once reserved for the elite. To the established nobility, this was terrifying. If a wealthy merchant could dress better than a count, then what did it even mean to be a count? If the visual language of status was corrupted, the whole social order could collapse. The sumptuary laws were the response. They were a set of rules designed to make sure that money could not buy social standing. You look down at your own feet. In the 14th century, there was a trend for shoes called polanes. These were shoes with incredibly long, pointed toes. Sometimes the toes were so long they had to be tied to the knees with silver chains just so the wearer could walk without tripping. The laws stepped in here with hilarious precision. If you were a commoner, your shoe point could only be a few inches long. If you were a knight, it could be longer. If you were a duke or a king, the point could be as long as you desired. The length of your toe was a direct measurement of your power. It sounds ridiculous, does it not? But think about the message it sends. A man with 2-foot-long toes cannot work in a field. He cannot easily climb a ladder or haul a sack of grain. Those shoes are a physical manifestation of leisure. By limiting the length of the shoe, the law was effectively saying, you are not allowed to pretend that you do not have to work for a living. Then there was the matter of fur. Fur was the ultimate status symbol because it was both expensive and incredibly soft. But even fur had a hierarchy. If you were a royal, you wore ermine, that pristine white fur with the little black tips. It was the symbol of purity and high office. If you were a wealthy merchant, you might be allowed to wear fox or otter. But if you were a laborer, you were strictly limited to the humblest of skins like rabbit, cat, or lamb. If you were caught wearing a fur that was above your station, you did not just face a social snub. You faced a heavy fine, and in some cases, the garment would be confiscated on the spot. Imagine the humiliation of being pulled aside in the middle of a busy market, having your expensive coat stripped from your back because your grandfather was not a knight. It was a public shaming that reinforced the boundaries of the world. But there was another reason for these laws that had nothing to do with social climbing. It was about cold, hard cash. This was an era before global trade was a balanced machine. When a wealthy Englishman bought a bolt of silk from Italy or a velvet cloak from France, that gold was leaving the country. It was disappearing into the pockets of foreign merchants. Kings like Edward III realized that this was a massive drain on the national economy. By passing laws that restricted who could wear imported luxury fabrics, they were effectively practicing an early form of economic protectionism. They wanted the people to buy English wool. They wanted the gold to stay within the borders. If they could convince the middle class that wearing local wool was not just a choice, but a legal necessity, they could keep the kingdom's wealth from bleeding out across the channel. There was also a moral dimension to this. The church was a powerful force in every aspect of medieval life, and the preachers were constantly railing against the sin of pride. They saw these elaborate fashions as a sign of spiritual decay. They called the long-pointed shoes the devil's claws. They looked at the huge, padded sleeves and the towering headdresses of the women and saw a society that was more concerned with the flesh than the soul. By enforcing sumptuary laws, the state was aligning itself with the church. They were saying that modesty was not just a virtue, but a civic duty. They were trying to curb the natural human urge to outdo one's neighbor. Of course, it did not work. Humans have always found ways to signal their status, and no amount of legislation could stop the tide of fashion. If a merchant was forbidden from wearing silk, he would simply buy the highest quality wool possible and dye it a color that was just a shade away from the restricted royal purple. If he could not have long toes on his shoes, he would have the most intricate embroidery on his belt. The struggle between the law and the individual's desire for status was a constant game of cat and mouse. As you continue your walk through this medieval city, you start to realize that these rules were the only way the people of the time knew how to process a world that was changing too fast. The feudal system was dying. The middle class was rising. The old certainties were melting away. By regulating the threads on a man's back, the authorities were trying to weave the social fabric back together. They wanted to look out over a crowd and know exactly who was in charge, who was to be respected, and who was to be ignored. It was a visual shorthand for a complicated world. It was an attempt to keep the peace by making sure everyone knew their place, from the tip of their pointed shoes to the top of their regulated hats. When you see a man in a simple brown tunic today, you might think he is just a guy who likes the color brown. But in the 14th century, that brown tunic was a statement. It was a sign of his obedience to the law, his station in life, and his role in the great, complex machine of the medieval state. The clothes did not just make the man. They defined his entire existence in the eyes of the law and the eyes of God. As the sun begins to set over the timbered houses and the shadows stretch across the cobblestones, the colors of the clothes begin to fade into gray. But the rules remain. Even in the dark, the rustle of a specific silk or the jingle of a silver chain on a shoe tells a story of power, fear, and the eternal human desire to stand out from the crowd, even when the law demands that we blend in. The marketplace begins to quiet down, but the tension of the era remains. This was a world where a misplaced piece of velvet could cost you a year's wages, and where your very identity was stitched into your collar. It was a world of rigid lines in a time of fluid change, and those lines were held together by the very threads the people wore on their backs. The city settles into its nightly rhythm, the bells of the cathedral ringing out over the rooftops. Every hat, every sleeve, and every shoe is exactly where it is supposed to be, reinforcing the invisible walls that keep the social structure from collapsing into the mud. You can feel the weight of it, the heavy pressure of a society that prizes stability above all else, using the simple tools of needle and thread to hold the chaos at bay. The threads of power were the lifelines of a society in transition, and every person you met on the street was a walking testament to the rules that kept their world from falling apart. As you step out of the shadows and back into your own time, you might find yourself looking at your own clothes a little differently, wondering what they would have said about you 600 years ago. The past is never truly gone. It is woven into the very fabric of our history, waiting to be unraveled by those who know where to look. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a vast, shadow-drenched woodland in the year 1100. The air is thick with the scent of damp moss, rotting leaves, and the sharp metallic tang of an autumn frost. To your left, the village where you were born is a collection of timber-framed huts huddling for warmth. To your right, the tree line looms like a wall of living spears. You are hungry, your family is hungry, and right there, stepping daintily through the ferns, is a stag. Its coat is the color of polished mahogany, and its antlers are a crown of ivory. One well-placed arrow could feed your entire hamlet for a week. But you do not reach for your bow. In fact, you back away as if the animal were made of fire. You know that if you so much as startle that deer, the price you pay will be written in your own blood. Under the laws of the land, that deer is not just an animal. It is a living extension of the king's will. To touch it is to touch the crown itself, and the punishment for doing so is often more creative and more permanent than a simple trip to the gallows. Welcome to the world of the royal forest. To a modern mind, the forest laws of medieval England and Europe seem like the ultimate expression of royal ego. We imagine a greedy king sitting on a throne, demanding every piece of venison for himself while his subjects starve. We see it as a weird, cruel whim of a tyrant. But as you walk deeper into these woods with me, you will begin to see that these laws were not just about sport or snacks. They were a brutal, sophisticated, and entirely necessary tool for national survival. They were the world's first true environmental protection acts, designed to save a kingdom from eating itself into oblivion. First, we have to clear up a common misunderstanding. When you hear the word forest, you probably think of a dense collection of trees. But in the medieval world, a forest with a capital F was a legal term. It was a specific geographic area, sometimes covering entire counties, where a completely different set of laws applied. You could have a forest that included open heaths, marshlands, and even entire villages. When the king declared an area a royal forest, he was essentially placing it in a legal bubble. Inside that bubble, the common law of the land stopped and the forest law began. You feel the weight of this law the moment you own a dog. If you live within the boundaries of a royal forest and you keep a dog that is large enough to hunt, the king's men will come to your door. They will not take your dog, but they will perform a process called lawing or expeditation. They take a chisel and a mallet, and they strike off the 3 claws of the dog's front foot. They do this so the dog can still walk and guard your home, but it can never again run fast enough to chase the king's deer. It is a grisly, visceral reminder of who truly owns the landscape. Why such cruelty? Why such control? To understand, you have to look at what was happening to the landscape of Europe. Populations were booming. People needed wood for fire, wood for houses, and wood for tools. More importantly, they needed land to grow grain. Left to their own devices, the peasants and the local lords would have cleared every single acre of woodland to make room for wheat and barley. They would have stripped the hillsides bare for firewood. Now imagine a kingdom with no trees. You might think it just means less shade, but in the Middle Ages, a kingdom without trees was a kingdom that could not defend itself. Every single piece of military technology depended on the forest. You need longbows? You need yew trees. You need spears and pike shafts. You need ash. You need to build a castle. You need massive scaffolding and heavy doors of oak. And most importantly, if you want to be a power on the global stage, you need a navy. A single medieval warship could require over 2,000 mature oak trees. These trees had to be managed. They had to be protected for decades, even centuries, before they were ready to be shaped into a hull that could withstand the battering of the Atlantic. If the king allowed you and your neighbors to cut down the oaks for your hearth fires today, there would be no fleet to stop an invasion 50 years from now. The forest laws were a way of saying that the long-term survival of the nation outweighed the short-term hunger of the individual. The king's deer were the guardians of the king's timber. By making it a capital offense to hunt in the woods, the king ensured that people stayed out of them, and by staying out, the ecosystem was preserved. As you walk further into the woods, you might notice the verdeers and the agisters. These were the police of the forest. They weren't just looking for poachers. They were looking for people committing greenhew, which was the crime of cutting down living wood. If you were caught with a branch of green oak, you were in as much trouble as if you had killed a stag. They were also looking for people who were overgrazing the land. This brings us to the second reason these laws existed: food security for the masses. It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? How does banning people from hunting help feed them? The answer lies in the delicate balance of the medieval pasture. If every farmer was allowed to turn their pigs and cattle into the woods at will, the animals would eat every acorn, every sapling, and every bit of ground cover. Within a few seasons, the forest would die, the soil would erode, and the local climate would shift. The forest laws created a strictly timed system. There was a season called pannage, usually a few weeks in the autumn, when the king would allow the peasants to bring their pigs into the woods to eat the fallen acorns. This was a vital resource for the poor, but it was only possible because the king's laws kept the woods healthy the rest of the year. By treating the forest as his personal playground, the king was actually acting as a grand steward of a communal resource that would have been destroyed by the tragedy of the commons. But there is a darker, more political side to this that you would have felt in your bones as a medieval subject. The forest laws were a tool of absolute sovereignty. When William the Conqueror came from Normandy and took England, he didn't just want the gold and the cities. He wanted the land itself. By creating the New Forest, he famously evicted entire villages and burned down churches to create a hunting ground. To the people of the time, this seemed like the ultimate act of a conqueror. He was saying, I own the very dirt you walk on. I own the air. I own the beasts of the field. For a king, the forest laws were a way to bypass the power of the nobles. In the rest of the kingdom, the king had to deal with barons and lords who had their own rights and their own armies. But in the royal forest, the king was the only law. It was a massive source of revenue. If you were caught breaking a forest rule, the king didn't always want your head. He wanted your money. The forest courts were famous for their massive fines. It was a medieval version of a speed trap, but on a national scale. This money went directly into the royal treasury, bypasses the sticky fingers of the nobility, and funded the defense of the realm. You can see the tension this caused by looking at the Magna Carta. When we think of that famous document, we think of the right to a trial by jury. But shortly after the Magna Carta was signed, the people demanded a second document, the Charter of the Forest. This was arguably more important to the average person. It scaled back the king's power, ended the practice of blinding poachers, and gave some rights back to the common people. But even then, the core of the laws remained. Why? Because even the barons realized that if the forests were completely deregulated, the kingdom would lose its most valuable strategic asset. So, as you step out of the trees and back toward your village, look at the forest one last time. It isn't just a place of trees and animals. It is a warehouse of naval timber. It is a massive living bank account for the crown. It is a complex grazing system that keeps the soil from washing away. And yes, it is a place where a king can pretend to be a hero of old, chasing a white stag through the thicket. The rules were weird. They were often heartless. The idea that a king could own a wild animal that wandered onto your farm seems like the height of absurdity. But without those rules, the landscape of the world would look very different today. We would have lost our ancient woodlands centuries earlier. We would have seen the total collapse of the timber industry long before the Industrial Revolution. The king's deer were not just targets for sport. They were the silent sentinels of a national security policy that understood one thing very clearly. A nation that consumes its foundation today will have nothing to stand on tomorrow. The king's deer lived, so the kingdom could survive. Imagine you are standing in the nave of a cold, stone church in the middle of the 12th century. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the damp, earthy smell of a building that has absorbed centuries of winter rains. Your heart is hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. You have been accused of a crime. Perhaps a neighbor claims you stole a precious silver chalice, or maybe you have been accused of something darker, like arson or murder. In this world, there are no fingerprint kits. There is no DNA evidence. There are no grainy security camera feeds to replay the moments of the alleged crime. There is only your word against the word of your accuser. In a modern courtroom, this might lead to a stalemate or a long, drawn-out trial based on circumstantial evidence. But in the medieval world, the community needs a resolution. They need to know the truth, not just for the sake of justice, but for the sake of their own souls and the social fabric of the village. And so, the local magistrate and the priest turn to the ultimate witness. They turn to God. You look down at the floor. Between you and the altar, a fire has been prepared in a heavy iron brazier. Resting in the glowing coals is a bar of iron. turning a dull, terrifying red. This is the trial by ordeal. To the modern mind, this sounds like nothing more than state-sanctioned torture disguised as piety. We see it as a barbaric relic of a superstitious age, a heads I win, tails you lose scenario where the innocent are burned and the guilty are burned even worse. But if you look closer, through the eyes of the people living in that stone church, you start to see a strange and brilliant logic at work. The trial by ordeal was not a failure of the legal system. It was a sophisticated, psychological tool designed to protect the innocent and expose the guilty in a world where human evidence was often impossible to find. Let us walk through the process as you would have experienced it. Before you ever touch that red-hot iron, the church imposes a period of 3 days. For 72 hours, you are placed under the supervision of the priest. You are required to fast, to pray, and to attend Massachusetts. During these 3 days, the priest is not just praying for your soul. He is watching you. He is observing your every movement, the tremor in your hands, the way you avoid eye contact, or the steady, resolute calm of your voice. This 3-day waiting period is the first layer of the strategic utility of the ordeal. It serves as a massive psychological pressure cooker. If you are truly guilty, you believe with every fiber of your being that God is watching. You believe that the moment your hand touches that iron, God will not only allow the fire to sear your flesh, but He will also condemn your soul to eternal fire. You are trapped. If you go through with the ordeal, you will be maimed and then likely executed. If you confess now, your punishment might be a heavy fine, a public penance, or perhaps a period of exile. For a guilty person who believes in the literal power of God, the 3-day wait is an invitation to settle out of court. This is what historians and economists call a separating equilibrium. The system is designed to sort the population into 2 groups: those who believe they are innocent and those who know they are guilty. Because the medieval world was a place of deep, unquestioning faith, the threat of divine intervention was a very real deterrent. Most guilty people simply did not show up for the final test. They fled the village under the cover of night, or they confessed and begged for mercy. Only the truly innocent, those who believed that God would provide a miracle to save them, were willing to stand before that brazier on the 4th day. Now, imagine you are one of those innocent people. You have stayed. You have fasted. You have sworn on the holy relics that you are blameless. The 3 days are over. The priest leads you to the fire. The congregation is watching, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The priest blesses the iron. He prays for God to reveal the truth. He then instructs you to pick up the red-hot bar, carry it a distance of 9 feet, and set it down. You do it. The pain is unimaginable. Your flesh hisses against the metal. But the ordeal is not over when you drop the iron. The true test begins now. The priest carefully wraps your burned hand in clean linen and seals the bandages with wax. You are sent home. You are told to return in 3 days. When you return, the entire community gathers again. The priest breaks the wax seal and unwinds the linen. He is looking for a sign. If the wound is infected, if it is oozing and putrid, you are declared guilty. God has spoken. But if the wound is healing cleanly, if the blisters are clear and the skin is beginning to knit back together, you are declared innocent. You are exonerated. Your honor is restored. Here is where the strategic utility becomes even more fascinating. Historical records from the Middle Ages show a surprising trend. A staggering number of people who underwent the ordeal were found innocent. In some regions, the acquittal rate was over 90%. How is this possible? If you carry a red-hot iron, your hand is going to be horribly burned every single time. Physics does not change just because you are in a church. The secret lay with the priest. The priest was the one who prepared the iron. He was the one who managed the fire. He was the one who wrapped the bandages and, most importantly, he was the one who interpreted the results. If a priest spent 3 days watching a man who seemed genuinely pious, calm, and insistent on his innocence, the priest had a strong incentive to ensure that man passed the test. He might not keep the iron in the fire quite as long. He might ensure the water for the ordeal of the cauldron was not at a rolling boil, but merely steaming. He might apply certain salves or clean dressings that promoted healing rather than infection. The priest was not being a cheat, he was being a judge. He was using the theater of the ordeal to give the community the miracle they needed to maintain peace. By the time a person actually reached the point of touching the iron, the priest was already fairly certain of their innocence. The ordeal provided a divine rubber stamp for a human observation. It allowed the community to move past an accusation without the lingering resentment of a not guilty verdict delivered by a mere human judge. If God said you were innocent, then the matter was closed forever. No one could start a blood feud over a judgment handed down by heaven. Consider the other common forms of the ordeal, like the trial by cold water. In this version, you were tied up and lowered into a pool of water that had been blessed by a priest. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. The logic was that the pure water, having been blessed, would reject a sinful, guilty body. Again, this sounds like a death sentence. If you sink while tied up, you drown. But the records show that attendants held onto ropes attached to the accused. They pulled them up the moment they sank deep enough to prove their innocence. The strategic beauty of the cold water ordeal was even more subtle. A person who is terrified and guilty will often hyperventilate. They will gulp in air, their lungs will expand, and they will become more buoyant. They will float. An innocent person, resigned to God's will and calm in their faith, is more likely to exhale and stay still, making them sink. The physical reaction to the fear of God actually produced the evidence the court needed. We often look back at the medieval period as a time of chaos and unreasoning cruelty. But the trial by ordeal shows us a society that was desperately trying to find a way to be fair in an age of limited information. They understood that the human heart is a dark and hidden place, and that sometimes the only way to get to the truth is to create a situation where the truth is the only safe option. The ordeal eventually faded away, not because people stopped being superstitious, but because the church itself began to change. In the year 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council forbade priests from participating in the trials. Without the religious blessing, the theater of the ordeal lost its power. Without the priest to manage the fire and interpret the wounds, the strategic utility vanished. The legal system was forced to find a new way to determine the truth. This led to the rise of the jury system, where 12 ordinary people would sit in judgment of their peers. It is easy to see the jury as a more enlightened system, but for many years after the ordeal was abolished, people were actually terrified of juries. They didn't trust 12 fallible neighbors to know the truth of their hearts. They missed the certainty of the red-hot iron. They missed the idea that there was a witness who could see through lies and provide a definitive, divine answer. The trial by ordeal was a strange rule, certainly. It was a brutal, searing, and terrifying way to run a courtroom. But it existed for a very good reason. It was a bridge between the seen and the unseen worlds. It was a way to use faith as a forensic tool, ensuring that in a world without science, the guilty would be haunted by their own shadows, and the innocent would have a path, however painful, to prove their truth. You may walk out of that stone church with a scarred hand, but in the eyes of your neighbors and your God, you are clean. And in the 12th century, that was a miracle worth the burn. You are standing in the dusty square of a small village in northern France. It is a humid afternoon in the late 14th century. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, livestock, and the heavy metallic tang of unwashed bodies. You see a crowd gathered, their faces grim and expectant. They are not here for a market day or a festival. They are here for a trial. But as you push through the throng to get a better view of the wooden platform erected in the center of the square, your breath catches. Standing there, flanked by guards and facing a judge in heavy robes, is not a man. It is a pig. The sow is not just any animal. She is dressed in a man's jacket and a pair of breeches, her front trotters tied as if they were hands. A lawyer stands beside her, shuffling papers and looking quite serious. This is the year 1386 in the town of Falaise, and you are witnessing one of the strangest spectacles of the medieval world. A formal criminal trial of an animal. To your modern eyes, this looks like a fever dream or a dark comedy. But for the people standing around you, this is a somber, necessary act of justice. They are not laughing. They are waiting for the law to restore the balance of their world. You might wonder how a society that built cathedrals and founded universities could find it logical to put a farm animal in the dock. To understand this, you have to look at the world through their eyes. In the medieval mind, the universe was not a collection of random events. It was a perfectly ordered hierarchy called the Great Chain of Being. God was at the top, followed by angels, then humans, then animals, plants, and finally rocks. Everything had its place. When a pig attacked a child, as this sow in Falaise had done, it was not just a tragic accident. It was a violation of the natural order. An animal had risen up against its superior on the chain. If the community simply killed the pig in a fit of rage, they would be no better than the beast itself. To fix the hole in the universe, they needed the law. As you watch the proceedings, you notice the incredible attention to detail. This is not a lynch mob. The pig has been held in the same prison as human criminals. The town has paid for her food during her stay, and a lawyer has been appointed to defend her. This lawyer might argue that the pig was startled, or that her owner was the one truly at fault for leaving her unrestrained. Witnesses are called. They testify about the pig's behavior and the nature of the crime. The judge listens intently, nodding as he weighs the evidence. The purpose of this elaborate ritual is not really about the pig's soul or its understanding of right and wrong. It is about public order. Think about the psychological state of a village after a horrific event. A child has been killed. The parents are devastated, and the neighbors are terrified and angry. In a world without a professional police force or a complex social safety net, violence can spiral out of control very quickly. If the father of the child kills the pig, he might then turn his anger on the neighbor who owned the pig. Feuds could last for generations. But by bringing the pig to court, the state takes the responsibility for vengeance out of the hands of the individuals. The law steps in and says, "We will handle this. We will give you a formal, structured way to process your grief and your anger." By dressing the pig in human clothes, the community is performing a symbolic act. They are momentarily lifting the animal into the human sphere so that it can be held accountable by human rules. When the judge finally delivers the sentence, which in this case is death by public execution, it serves as a powerful visual lesson. You watch as the pig is led to the gallows. The executioner is there, wearing gloves to ensure his hands stay clean of the animal's blood, maintaining the dignity of his office. The execution is carried out with the same solemnity as if a murderer were being hanged. For the people watching beside you, this provides a sense of closure that a simple slaughtering never could. They see that the law is absolute. They see that even the lowliest creature cannot break the peace of the king or the peace of God without consequences. It reassures them that they live in an ordered world where justice is possible. It prevents the chaos of private revenge and reaffirms the power of the local authorities. But the medieval legal system did not stop at domestic animals like pigs, cows, or dogs. There was another, even stranger category of animal trials that dealt with creatures that could not be caught and put in a cell: pests. Imagine you are a farmer in the 15th century. Your entire year's crop, the food that will keep your children from starving through the winter, is being devoured by a plague of locusts or a swarm of weevils. You cannot arrest a million insects. You cannot put a beetle in a pair of breeches and hang it from a gallows. So what do? You go to the church. These were known as ecclesiastical trials. Since the pests were considered a part of God's creation, the secular courts had no power over them. Instead, the community would file a formal lawsuit against the insects in a church court. You would see a priest stand at the edge of the infested fields and deliver a formal summons to the creatures. He would command them to appear in court on a specific date to answer for the damage they had caused. If the insects failed to show up, which predictably they always did, the court would appoint a lawyer to represent their interests. This was not a joke. Some of the greatest legal minds of the era made their names in these cases. One famous lawyer, Bartholomew Chassaigne, became a legend for defending a group of rats in the early 16th century. When the rats failed to appear in court, Chassaigne argued that the summons had been too narrow. It had only been read in one part of the town, and since the rats were spread out across the entire region, they couldn't all have known about it. The judge agreed and ordered the summons to be read in every parish. When the rats still did not show up, Chassaigne offered another defense. He argued that his clients were more than willing to come to court, but they were afraid for their lives. To get to the courthouse, they had to pass through the streets where the townspeople's cats lived. Since a defendant has a right to a safe passage to their trial, and the cats were a mortal threat, the rats had a valid legal excuse for their absence. You might smile at the cleverness of the argument, but the reason behind it was deeply practical. The church used these trials to manage the expectations and the anxieties of the people. If the crops were failing, the people were desperate. Desperate people often look for someone to blame, leading to riots or the persecution of marginalized groups. By putting the pests on trial, the church provided a channel for that desperation. The trial would often end with a conditional curse or an excommunication of the insects. The priest would lead the village in a procession around the fields, sprinkling holy water and chanting. They would command the insects to leave the area within 3 days or face the wrath of God. If the insects happened to leave, perhaps because they had finished eating or the weather changed, it was a miracle that bolstered the faith of the community. If they stayed, the priest could argue that the people's sins were so great that God was using the pests as a punishment, and the only solution was more prayer and more donations to the church. Either way, the social fabric remained intact. The people felt they were doing something active and legal to solve the problem rather than lapsing into hopeless violence. These animal trials were a bridge between the wild, unpredictable natural world and the structured world of human society. They show a civilization that was obsessed with the idea of the rule of law. To the medieval person, the law was not just a set of rules for people. It was the underlying fabric of reality itself. If the law didn't apply to everything, then the world was a place of chaos and terror. By bringing the pig to the dock and the locust to the pulpit, they were asserting that reason and order could prevail over the darkest, most animalistic parts of existence. As you leave the town square of Falaise, the crowd begins to disperse. The tension has broken. The father of the child walks away with his head bowed, perhaps not happy, but at least feeling that his loss was acknowledged by the highest powers in the land. The owner of the pig has paid a fine, the animal is gone, and the village returns to its daily rhythm. Seems weird to you, yes, but in a time when the world felt small and dangers were everywhere, these trials were the glue that held a community together. They were a strange, elaborate, and ultimately very human way of saying that even in the face of tragedy and nature's indifference, there must be justice. You are standing in the center of a narrow, winding street in a city like London, Paris, or York in the late 11th century. It is late autumn, and the air carries a biting chill that seems to seep through the layers of your wool tunic. Above you, the wooden jetties of the houses lean inward, their timber frames almost touching, turning the street into a dark tunnel. Beneath your feet, the ground is a mixture of packed earth, straw, and the refuse of 1,000 daily lives. But more than the cold or the mud, what you notice most is the smell. It is a thick, omnipresent haze of wood smoke. Every single house you pass is breathing. Wisps of gray smoke curl out from small holes in the gables or seep directly through the thick bundles of straw that make up the thatched roofs. There are no brick chimneys here, at least not for someone of your standing. Instead, every family gathers around a central hearth. It is the literal heart of the home, a stone slab in the middle of a single room where a fire crackles day and night. It provides the only light you have to see by, the only heat to keep the damp at bay, and the only way to cook the pottage that keeps you alive. But in this world of wood and straw, that fire is also a sleeping predator. You look at the houses around you. They are built of wattle and daub, essentially woven sticks covered in a plaster of mud, straw, and animal dung. They are bone dry in the summer and filled with flammable bedding and rushes in the winter. One stray spark, one sleeve catching the flame, or one log rolling off the hearth while a family sleeps, and this entire street would be reduced to ash in minutes. Suddenly, a sound cuts through the evening air. It is heavy, metallic, and rhythmic. It is the tolling of a great bell from the local parish church. This is not a call to prayer, and it is not a warning of an invading army. It is something much more mundane, yet far more vital for your survival. It is the couvre-feu. In the French tongue of the ruling Normans, it literally means cover fire. Over the centuries, your descendants will shorten this phrase into a single word that still carries a sense of authority today. Curfew. When you hear that bell, your entire evening routine changes. You do not have a choice in the matter. This is one of the most strictly enforced laws in the medieval world, and for a very good reason. The law dictates that as soon as the bell rings, every hearth in the city must be extinguished or safely tucked away for the night. You walk back into your small home. The fire is glowing orange, casting long, dancing shadows against the timber walls. Your children are huddled near the warmth, reluctant to let it go. But you cannot risk the penalty, and you certainly cannot risk the flames. You reach for a specific tool that sits by the hearth. It is a large, heavy, dome-shaped vessel made of copper or ceramic, often with small ventilation holes near the rim. This is the curfew bell or the curfew plate. You do not simply throw water on your fire. To do so would ruin the precious charcoal and make it nearly impossible to restart the fire in the morning without an exhausting amount of effort with flint and steel. Instead, you use the curfew plate. You rake the glowing red embers into a neat pile in the center of the hearth and lower the heavy dome over them. The plate restricts the oxygen, dampening the flames until they are nothing but a low, controlled smolder. The heat is trapped inside, and the sparks are contained. The fire is not dead, but it is caged. Outside, you hear the heavy footsteps of the night watch. These are men appointed by the town to walk the streets and ensure the law is being followed. They look for the telltale glow of a window or the continued drift of smoke from a roof that should be dark. If they find you have ignored the bell, the consequences are severe. You could be fined a sum that would take weeks of labor to earn, or worse, you could be hauled before a magistrate. But as you lay down on your pallet of straw in the sudden, absolute darkness, you understand why the king and the lords are so obsessed with this rule. In a medieval city, fire is not a localized emergency. It is a regional catastrophe, because the houses are built so closely together, often sharing walls or roofs. A fire in your hearth is not just your problem. It is your neighbor's problem. It is the whole district's problem. There are no fire engines. There are no pressurized hoses. If a fire breaks out at 2 in the morning while the city is asleep, the only defense is the bucket brigade. You would have to wake up, find your leather bucket, and run to the nearest well or river, passing water hand to hand while the heat blisters your skin. More often than not, the only way to stop a fire from consuming the entire city is to use a fire hook. A massive iron hook on a long pole used to literally tear down the houses in the path of the flames to create a gap. You would have to destroy 10 homes to save 100. The curfew was a primitive but incredibly effective form of disaster prevention. It turned the responsibility of public safety into a personal, nightly ritual for every citizen. By forcing everyone to cover their coals at the same time, the authorities ensured that the highest risk of accidental ignition happened when people were still awake to watch it, and that during the hours of sleep, the city was as fireproof as it could possibly be. As you lie there in the dark, you realize that the curfew changes the very nature of the city. Before the bell, the streets might have had some life, with people moving between houses or finishing their work by the light of a tallow candle. After the bell, the city falls into a silence so profound it is hard for a modern mind to imagine. There is no hum of electricity, no distant roll of traffic. There is only the wind, the occasional bark of a dog, and the knowledge that every soul in the city is tucked away in the blackness. This law also served a secondary purpose, one that the rulers of the time were very keen on. By forcing people to extinguish their lights and stay indoors, the curfew made it much harder for people to gather in secret. In an age of frequent rebellions and nightly muggings, the curfew was a tool of social control. If you were caught out on the street after the bell without a very good reason and a lantern, you were immediately a suspect. You were either a thief, a murderer, or a conspirator. The darkness was the domain of the criminal, and the curfew was the law that sought to reclaim the night for the sake of order. But even with the political benefits, the primary driver remained the fear of the ash. History is dotted with the scars of cities that forgot the importance of the cover fire. You might think of the Great Fire of London in 1666, which, although centuries later, proved exactly what happens when a small fire in a bakery is allowed to catch in a crowded wooden city. Thousands of homes disappeared in a matter of days. The medieval mind lived with this fear every single day. In the morning, the ritual reverses. When the first light of dawn begins to creep through the cracks in your shutters, you rise from your bed, shivering in the morning frost. You go to the hearth and lift the heavy metal dome. Beneath it, protected and nurtured by the lack of air, the embers are still there. They are faint, glowing a dull crimson, but they are alive. You feed them a few shavings of wood, a handful of dry straw, and you blow gently. The glow brightens, the straw catches, and within minutes, The heart of your home is beating again. You have survived another night, and so has your city. The simple act of covering a pile of coals, mandated by a bell and enforced by the threat of a fine, was the thin line between a peaceful sleep and a waking nightmare of flame. We often think of medieval laws as being about cruelty or strange religious taboos, but the curfew shows us a different side of the era. It shows a society that was deeply aware of its own fragility. It shows a people who understood that in a world made of wood and straw, the safety of the many depended entirely on the discipline of the individual. So, the next time you hear the word curfew, do not just think of a teenager being told to be home by midnight or a city under lockdown. Think of the heavy copper dome. Think of the red embers waiting in the dark. Think of the silence of 1,000 homes, all holding their breath, waiting for the morning, and the simple rhythmic tolling of a bell that kept the world from burning down. It was a rule born of necessity, a law that recognized that the greatest power humans had discovered, the power of fire, was also the greatest threat to everything they had built. By covering the coals, they weren't just obeying a king. They were keeping the darkness and the fire at bay. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a bustling market square in the year 1350. The air is thick with the scent of damp wool, roasting meat, and the pungent, earthy aroma of animal waste. You have been working since sunrise, and your throat is parched. You are desperate for a drink, but you do not head for the nearest well. In this world, you know better than that. You know that the water shimmering at the bottom of a stone shaft might carry the very thing that ends your life by nightfall. To you, water is not a source of life. It is a gamble. Instead, you look for a different sign. You scan the timbered fronts of the houses until you see a long pole sticking out over the street, decorated at the end with a bunch of leafy greens or a simple wooden hoop. That is the Alishtake. That is where you will find your safety. In the medieval world, ale was not a luxury. It was not something you saved for a Friday night at the tavern. It was a caloric necessity. It was liquid bread. From the youngest child to the oldest laborer, everyone drank ale because the fermentation process made it safer than the local groundwater. It provided the energy needed to plow fields and the hydration needed to survive the summer heat. But this massive dependency created a terrifying opportunity for greed. Because everyone had to drink ale to survive, the people who made it held the life of the community in their hands. This led to a public health crisis that could have easily toppled cities. The solution was one of the most bizarre yet vital jobs in history. You are about to meet the ale taster. You might think of an ale taster as a lucky man with a dream job, someone who gets paid to wander from pub to pub getting drunk on the town treasury. But the reality was far more serious and much more uncomfortable. These men, also known as ale conners, were elected officials. They were chosen because they were honest, they were respected, and most importantly, they were experienced. They were the first line of defense against a rogue brewer who might try to poison an entire neighborhood just to save a few pennies on grain. As you walk through the muddy street, you see the ale conner approaching a house marked with an Alishtake. He is wearing heavy leather breeches, thick and stiff from years of use. He looks tired, and he carries a sense of gravity that feels out of place for someone about to have a drink. He is not there for a social call. He is there to perform a sensory inspection that is part chemistry, part law enforcement, and part sheer physical endurance. The problem facing the medieval public was twofold. First, there was the issue of price. The king had established the assize of bread and ale, a law that strictly regulated how much a gallon of ale should cost based on the current price of grain. If a brewer charged too much, they were essentially stealing from the mouths of the poor. Second, and more dangerously, was the issue of quality. A dishonest brewer might water down the ale to make it go further, leaving the laborers weak and malnourished. Or worse, they might try to hide the taste of sour, spoiled ale by adding dangerous additives. They might toss in salt to make you thirstier, or even more terrifying ingredients like lime or soot to change the color and texture. In a world without a Food and Drug Administration, the ale taster was the only thing standing between you and a slow, agonizing death from contaminated brew. Watch the ale conner as he enters the brewer's house. The brewer, often a woman known as an alewife, looks on nervously. She has just finished a fresh batch, and by law, she cannot sell a single drop until the official has cleared it. This is the rule. It is a strict, unyielding mandate. If she sells before the taster arrives, she faces a massive fine or the destruction of her inventory. The official does not just take a sip and nod. He begins by looking at the ale. He checks for clarity. He smells it for the telltale tang of spoilage. Then he performs the most famous and strange test in the history of food safety. He asks for a small amount of the fresh ale to be poured onto a clean wooden bench. Then, in his heavy leather breeches, he sits down. He sits directly into the puddle of ale. You might wonder what on earth he is doing. Is this a joke? Is it some medieval superstition? It is neither. This is a crude but effective test for sugar content and fermentation. The ale conner sits there, motionless, for 30 minutes. He chats with the brewer. He looks out the door. He waits. While he sits, the moisture in the ale begins to evaporate. If the brewer has followed the proper recipes and allowed the yeast to do its work, the sugars will have been converted into alcohol. But if the brewer has cheated, if they have added extra honey or sugar to hide the fact that the ale is weak, or if the fermentation is incomplete and the liquid is still full of unfermented wort, the liquid will become incredibly sticky. After half the hour has passed, the ale conner attempts to stand up. This is the moment of truth. If he rises easily, the ale is good. It is thin, clean, and properly fermented. But if his leather breeches stick to the bench, if he has to peel himself off the wood with a loud, tacky sound, or if the bench actually lifts up with him, the brewer is in deep trouble. The stickiness is the evidence of a crime. It is proof that the ale is not what it claims to be. It is proof of a public health violation. You see the brewer grow pale as the official struggles to detach himself from the seat. The ale conner does not offer a warning. He does not give a second chance. He is an officer of the court. He immediately declares the ale to be of poor quality. In some towns, this means the brewer must sell the ale at a much lower price, perhaps a farthing for a gallon instead of a penny. In other cases, the punishment is far more public and humiliating. If you follow the crowd later that afternoon, you might see the brewer being led toward the center of town. They are not being sent to a dark dungeon. Instead, they are being taken to the cucking stool. This is a chair fixed to the end of a long wooden beam over the local pond or the river. The brewer is strapped in while the neighbors gather around. This is not just about a bad drink. This is about a betrayal of the communal trust. The crowd jeers as the beam is tilted, and the brewer is dunked into the cold, murky water. They are pulled up, gasping, only to be dunked again. It is a public cleansing of a public sin. But why such extreme measures for a mug of ale? You have to understand the scale of the crisis. In a medieval city, thousands of people are living in cramped, unsanitary conditions. If a single large-scale brewer produces a batch of contaminated ale, they could incapacitate the entire workforce of a district. They could cause an outbreak of illness that would be indistinguishable from the plague to the terrified citizens. The ale taster was not just checking for flavor. He was the guardian of the city's energy. He was the inspector who ensured that the liquid fuel the people relied on was not going to kill them. As you finish your own mug of ale at a different house, one that the ale conner has already stamped with his approval, you feel the strength returning to your limbs. The ale is thick, slightly sweet, and very cloudy, looking nothing like the clear lagers of the future. It is lukewarm and tastes strongly of the grain it was made from. But it is safe. You can drink it with confidence because you know that a man in leather pants has literally put his own comfort on the line to verify its quality. This weird rule, this requirement for a professional taster to sit in puddles of beer, was the medieval version of a laboratory test. It was a response to a world where you could not trust the eyes or the promises of a merchant. It was a system built on physical evidence and public accountability. The ale taster had to be a man of integrity because he could easily be bribed. But the leather breeches did not lie. The stickiness of the bench was a physical fact that even the most silver-tongued brewer could not argue with. By the time the sun begins to set over the thatched roofs of the town, the ale conner is moving on to his 10th or 12th house of the day. He is likely slightly tipsy, despite his best efforts to stay professional. His breeches are stained and stiff with dried malt. He is an essential gear in the clockwork of the medieval economy. Without him, the assize of bread and ale is just words on a parchment. With him, it is a living, breathing shield for the poor. You watch him disappear down a side alley, his heavy boots clattering on the stones. You realize that the medieval world was not just a place of chaos and filth. It was a place where people worked desperately hard to create order out of that chaos. They knew their weaknesses. They knew that greed was as constant as the rain. And so, they created rules that seem ridiculous to us now, like sitting in beer to check its sugar content, because those rules were the only things keeping the social fabric from tearing apart. The next time you take a sip of a cold drink, you might think of the ale conner. You might think of the man who stood between a thirsty population and a public health disaster. He was the unsung hero of the tavern, the man who ensured that your liquid gold was pure, honest, and above all, safe. He was the reason you could wake up the next morning and go back to work, instead of falling victim to the hidden dangers of a dishonest brew. In the flickering light of the evening fires, the weirdness of the rule fades away, leaving only the simple, vital necessity of a job well done. You are standing in the middle of a narrow, twisting street in London in the year 1314. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, raw sewage, and the salty tang of the River Thames nearby. Usually, this is a place of business, a chaotic symphony of blacksmiths hammering and merchants shouting their prices. But today, the shops are shuttered. The heavy wooden doors are bolted from the inside. A strange, heavy silence hangs over the cobblestones, broken only by a distant, low rumble that sounds like an approaching thunderstorm. Then you hear it, a roar of voices, hundreds of them, echoing off the timber-framed buildings. Around the corner, a massive wall of humanity bursts into view. This is not a riot, though to your modern eyes, it looks like one. This is a game of football. But forget everything you know about the modern sport. There are no jerseys, no referees, and certainly no stadium. There is no pitch with neatly painted white lines. The pitch is the entire town. The goal might be a specific gate on the other side of the city, or perhaps the porch of a church 2 miles away. The ball is not a pressurized leather sphere but a bloated pig bladder, stuffed with hay or dried peas and sewn shut with rough twine. As the mob surges toward you, you have to leap into a doorway to avoid being crushed. Men are shoving, punching, and grappling. They are rolling in the mud of the gutters, their clothes torn to rags. There are no rules against tripping, no penalties for a high tackle, and if someone gets a broken rib or a black eye, it is considered part of the fun. This is what historians call mob football, and in the 14th century, it was the most popular pastime in England. It was also, according to the king, a direct threat to the safety of the realm. On April 13, 1314, King Edward II issued a proclamation that would make him very unpopular in the taverns of London. He didn't just suggest people stop playing. He banned the game entirely under the threat of imprisonment. You might think he was just a killjoy or that he was worried about the property damage, which was admittedly extensive. When 300 men charged through a marketplace chasing a bladder, windows tend to shatter and stalls tend to collapse. But the king had a much deeper, much more terrifying reason for his decree. He was looking at his borders, he was looking at his enemies, and he realized that football was making England vulnerable to invasion. To understand why a game of ball was a national security risk, you have to look at the weapon that defined the English Middle Ages, the longbow. You walk away from the chaos of the city and head toward the outskirts of a small village on a Sunday afternoon. Here, the atmosphere is different. In an open field, you see a row of tall, wooden targets called butts. Every man in the village, from the age of 7 to 60, is gathered here. They aren't laughing or wrestling. They are working. The English longbow was a terrifying piece of technology. It was a simple stave of yew wood, roughly 6 feet long, but it required an immense amount of strength to use. A modern hunting bow might have a draw weight of 40 or 50 pounds. An English longbow required a pull of over 100 pounds, sometimes as high as 150. To pull that string back to your ear and hold it steady enough to aim, you needed more than just a bit of muscle. You needed a lifetime of physical conditioning. Your bones literally had to grow differently to accommodate the strain. If you were to look at the skeletal remains of a medieval archer today, you would see the proof of this. The bones of their left arms, which held the bow, are often thicker and more dense than their right. Their shoulders are often slightly lopsided, and their spinal columns show signs of heavy, repetitive stress. This was a craft that took years, even decades, to master. An archer wasn't made in a boot camp. An archer was grown from a boy into a man with a bow in his hand. Now imagine you are King Edward. You are constantly at war with the Scots to the north and the French across the sea. Your entire military strategy relies on having thousands of these master archers ready to go at a moment's notice. But there is a problem. Human nature is the same then as it is now. If you give a young man the choice between standing in a field for 4 hours practicing the grueling, repetitive, and painful art of archery, or heading into town to play a wild, high-stakes game of football with his friends, he is going to choose the football every single time. Football was the ultimate distraction. It was addictive, it was social, and it used up all the energy a man had left after a week of laboring in the fields. Every hour spent chasing a pig bladder was an hour not spent at the archery butts. And in the eyes of the crown, that was a form of accidental treason. As you stand by the archery butts, you can see the resentment on the faces of the younger men. They look toward the village, perhaps hearing the faint shouts of a hidden game of ball happening behind a barn where the king's officials might not look. But the law was clear. By 1363, Edward III took things even further. He didn't just ban football. He commanded that every able-bodied man must practice archery on every feast day and Sunday. He listed the forbidden games by name: handball, football, hockey, coursing, and cockfighting. These were declared idle, useless, and deceptive games that offered no value to the kingdom. You see, the survival of England depended on a specific kind of peasant. If the French king decided to cross the channel with his knights in shining armor, the only thing that could stop them was a hail of arrows. At the Battle of Crécy, English archers launched an estimated 500,000 arrows in a single afternoon. That kind of sustained, rhythmic devastation is only possible if your soldiers have been training since they were children. If those men had spent their youth playing football instead, the arrows would have fallen short, the bowstrings would have snapped their unconditioned wrists, and the history of Europe would have been rewritten in a single day. The ban on football wasn't about public order, though that was a nice side effect for the shopkeepers who didn't want their storefronts smashed. It was a massive, nationwide human resource management program. The king was essentially seizing the leisure time of the entire population and turning it into a military training exercise. You walk through the village and notice the constable keeping a sharp eye on the crowd. If he catches a group of men with a ball, he won't just take the ball away. The fines were heavy, and the threat of jail was real. Yet the game survived. It was the underground sport of the Middle Ages. No matter how many times the kings of England banned it, the people kept playing. They played in secret clearings, they played in the back alleys, and they played whenever the authorities weren't looking. But the royal pressure worked just enough. The English longbow remained the dominant force on the battlefield for over 2 centuries. The weird rule that told you to put down the ball and pick up the bow was the reason why a small island nation could punch so far above its weight class. As the sun begins to set over the practice field, you see the men finally lowering their bows. Their fingers are calloused, their backs are aching, and their arms are trembling from the effort of pulling back 100 pounds of you over and over again. They aren't doing this for sport. They are doing it because the law demands it, and because they know that their skill is the only thing standing between their homes and the fires of war. The next time you see a football match on a bright green field with a referee in a whistle and players in high-tech gear, remember the muddy streets of old London. Remember the king who looked at a game and saw a national crisis. In the medieval world, the line between a hobby and a hazard was thin, and the choice between playing a game and preparing for war was one that a king simply couldn't leave to chance. The ban on football wasn't an act of tyranny against fun. It was a desperate, calculated move to ensure that when the trumpets sounded, the men of England would be ready with a bow in hand, rather than a ball at their feet. The quiet of the archery range was the sound of a kingdom protecting its future, one arrow at a time. Imagine the rhythm of your own frantic breathing. It is the only sound you can hear over the heavy thud of your boots striking the packed earth and the distant, muffled shouts of the men behind you. Your chest burns. Your legs feel like lead. You are rounded a corner, the narrow street of the medieval town closing in on you with its overhanging timber frames. You are not a murderer, but in the eyes of the law, you might as well be. You are a weaver whose loom caught fire, a fire that spread to your neighbor's shop. Now, you owe a debt so vast that your entire family would be sold into service for generations to pay it back. Or perhaps you struck a nobleman's servant in a moment of desperate anger. Either way, the local bailiffs are minutes away, and the justice of the king is swift, cold, and final. Then you see it. Rising above the thatched roofs and the smoke of the chimneys is the gray stone tower of the parish church. It looks like a fortress, and in many ways it is. You reach the heavy oak doors, your fingers fumbling for the iron ring bolted to the wood. You grasp it, your knuckles white, and you scream the word. Sanctuary. The pursuit stops. The men chasing you pull up short, their boots skidding in the mud. They curse and they spit on the ground, but they do not touch you. They cannot. You have just entered a legal bubble that defies the power of the throne. You have entered the world of the sacred shelter, a rule that seems like a loophole for criminals but was actually one of the most sophisticated economic and social safety nets of the Middle Ages. Step inside. The air is cool and smells of beeswax, old stone, and stale incense. The chaos of the street is replaced by a heavy, echoing silence. A monk or a parish clerk approaches you, not with a sword, but with a ledger. They do not ask if you are innocent. They ask if you are seeking the peace of the church. You nod, still gasping for air. With that nod, the machinery of medieval mercy begins to turn. To a modern mind, the idea of a church being a get-out-of-jail-free card seems absurd. We imagine it as a way for the guilty to hide from justice. But in the 12th and 13th centuries, the law was a blunt instrument. There was no professional police force, no nuanced system of bail, and very few ways to settle disputes that did not involve someone losing their life or their entire livelihood. If you killed a man in a tavern brawl, his family was legally entitled to kill you in return. If you fell into debt, you didn't go to bankruptcy court. You went to a dungeon where you would rot until your family paid up. The rule of sanctuary was the pressure valve that kept the entire steam engine of medieval society from exploding. It provided the one thing the king's law did not: time. Once you gripped that door knocker, you were granted 40 days of protection. During these 40 days, the secular authorities were forbidden from entering the church to seize you. If they tried, they faced the ultimate penalty of excommunication, a spiritual death sentence that could ruin even a powerful lord. But you weren't just sitting there hiding. You were in a state of legal limbo. Think of this period as a cooling-off session. In a world of hot blood and quick tempers, 40 days allowed the red mist of anger to clear. The monks would act as intermediaries. They would go to the people chasing you, the people you owed money to, or the family of the man you injured. They would negotiate. They would talk about blood money, known as wergild, or the restructuring of debts. Because you were safe inside the church, your enemies had to consider a settlement. If you were dead, they got nothing. If you were in sanctuary, they might at least get some form of compensation. But what if you couldn't pay? What if the crime was too great for a simple apology and a bag of coins? This is where the rule gets truly fascinating. You had a choice to make before your 40 days were up. You could surrender to the king's justice and face the trial, or you could confess your crime to the coroner and perform a ritual known as abjuring the realm. Picture yourself standing before the coroner at the church gate. You are dressed in the simplest of robes, barefoot and hatless. You are a shadow of the person you were. You swear an oath on the Bible that you have committed a felony and that you will leave the Kingdom of England forever. The coroner then assigns you a port, perhaps Dover or Bristol. He hands you a small wooden cross to carry in your hand. This cross is your passport. It tells anyone you meet on the road that you are a protected person under the church's peace. You have to stay on the main highway. You cannot turn left or right. You cannot spend more than 2 nights in the same place. You must walk toward the sea, day after day, until you reach the docks and board a ship, never to return on pain of death. This seems like a harsh punishment, and it was. You lost your home, your family, your property, and your status. You were effectively dead in the eyes of the law. But for the economy of the village you left behind, this was a victory. In the medieval world, the loss of a single able-bodied man to a long blood feud or a permanent prison stay could ruin a small community. By forcing the offender into exile, the cycle of violence was broken. The village didn't have to deal with a lingering vendetta. The family of the victim felt that justice had been served through the offender's total loss of his life's work. The economic safety net of sanctuary extended even further in certain cities. In London, there were places like St. Martin le Grand. These were large precincts that held permanent sanctuary status. If you were a merchant whose business had collapsed due to a shipwreck or a bad harvest, you could move your family into the precinct of St. Martin's. Within those walls, the king's debt collectors could not touch you. You might think these places became dens of thieves, and to some extent they did. But they were also vibrant hubs of industry. Because the residents couldn't leave, they set up shops within the sanctuary walls. They became shoemakers, tailors, and goldsmiths. They were called foreigners even if they were born in London, because they lived outside the jurisdiction of the city guilds. This created a strange, unintended pocket of free trade. These sanctuary men could produce goods cheaper than the guild members outside the walls, providing affordable products to the poor and keeping the local economy moving even during times of financial crisis. You have to look at the landscape of the past to understand why the church fought so hard to keep these rules. The medieval church was not just a religious institution. It was the only social service provider in existence. It ran the hospitals, the schools, and the poor relief. Sanctuary was their way of checking the power of the crown. Without it, a king could simply arrest anyone who owed him money or disagreed with his taxes. By claiming sanctuary, a subject could appeal to a higher power, forcing the state to follow a process rather than acting on a whim. As you stand in the quiet nave of the church, looking up at the light filtering through the stained glass, you realize that this rule wasn't about letting people get away with crimes. It was about mercy in a world that had very little of it. It was about recognizing that humans are flawed, that debts happen, and that killing a man for his mistakes often causes more harm to society than letting him walk to the sea with a wooden cross in his hand. The system eventually faded as the law became more sophisticated. By the time of the Tudors, the king's power had grown so great that the idea of a church door stopping a bailiff seemed like an ancient fairy tale. Debt laws were rewritten, and the first versions of bankruptcy began to appear. But for hundreds of years, the sanctuary was the only thing standing between an ordinary person and total oblivion. You look down at your hands, still trembling from the chase. You have 40 days. 40 days to pray, 40 days to negotiate, and 40 days to decide if you will face the king or walk to the sea. The church has given you a second chance, not because it thinks you are innocent, but because it knows that a living exile is better for the world than a dead debtor. You take a breath, the scent of the incense finally calming your heart. The rule of the sacred shelter has done its job. It has turned a moment of certain death into a path toward a new, albeit difficult, life. The heavy doors behind you remain closed, a silent barrier against the storm of the world outside. In the medieval mind, justice was not just about punishment. It was about balance. And sometimes, to keep the balance of a kingdom, you had to give a man a place to hide. You are standing in a field in Sussex, and the year is 1066. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool, horse sweat, and the iron tang of blood. The ground beneath your boots is slick with mud, and the roar of thousands of men screaming in 2 different languages fills your ears until your head thumps. In this moment, you are not a student of history. You are a soldier. You are terrified. You are exhausted. And most importantly, you are confused. In the chaos of a medieval shield wall, there are no brightly colored uniforms. There are no camouflage patterns or digital radio signals to tell you who is a friend and who is a foe. You are surrounded by men wearing similar chainmail hauberks, carrying similar wooden shields, and wielding similar iron axes. If you turn too quickly and see a face through the slit of a helmet, how do you know, in a fraction of a second, whether to lower your guard or drive your spear home? You look to your left. You see a man with hair flowing down to his shoulders, a thick, drooping mustache framing his mouth, and a rugged beard. You look to your right. You see a man whose head is shaved so high up the back that he looks almost bald from behind, yet he has a neatly trimmed fringe in the front. He has no beard and no mustache. In the heat of the Battle of Hastings, that patch of bare skin on the back of a skull is the only thing telling you who is a Norman and who is a Saxon. This was not a choice made for the sake of vanity. This was a grooming regulation that functioned as a primitive form of combat identification. Today, we think of hair as a deeply personal expression of style. You might choose to grow a beard because you like the look, or shave your head because it is easier to manage. But in the Middle Ages, your hair was a legal document written on your body. It told the world your rank, your religion, and your allegiance. To the medieval mind, a man who changed his hair without permission was a man trying to hide his identity. And in a world without fingerprints or photo identification, that was a crime against the social order. Imagine you are a Saxon scout peering through the trees at the invading Norman camp. You might report back to King Harold that you saw an army of priests. Why? Because the Normans were so clean-shaven, and their hair was cut so short in the back, that from a distance they resembled the tonsured monks of the English monasteries. This was a deliberate military tactic. By enforcing a specific, uniform haircut across the entire invading force, William the Conqueror ensured that his men could recognize each other even when their shields were lost and their banners were trampled into the dirt. But these rules went far beyond the battlefield. Let us walk into a medieval courtroom in the 13th century. You are sitting on a wooden bench, listening to a judge bark at a defendant. The crime? A man has been accused of cutting another man's beard against his will. To you, this might sound like a minor scuffle or a prank gone wrong. To the medieval person, this was an act of extreme violence, often treated with the same severity as cutting off a limb. Why? Because your beard was your honor. For a knight or a freeman, a full beard was a sign of virility and independence. To have it forcibly shaved was to be symbolically castrated or reduced to the status of a slave. In many Germanic and Anglo-Saxon law codes, the fine for damaging a man's beard was higher than the fine for breaking his ribs. The law protected the beard because the beard protected the man's social standing. If you lost your beard, you lost your voice in the community. You were no longer a man of standing, you were a victim. Now, consider the life of a monk. You walk into the cold, stone silence of a monastery in Burgundy. You see rows of men with the centers of their heads shaved perfectly smooth, leaving only a ring of hair that looks like a crown of thorns. This is the tonsure. You might think it is just a quirky religious tradition, but it served a very practical legal purpose. In the Middle Ages, the clergy were governed by different laws than the laity. If a monk committed a crime, he was tried in a church court, which was often far more lenient than the king's court. The tonsure was a permanent, visible marker of that legal status. It was a sign that said, "I am under the protection of the church." If you were a criminal on the run and you tried to shave your own head into a tonsure to escape the hangman, you were committing a form of identity theft that the authorities took very seriously. The hair was the badge. Without it, you were just another body in the crowd. As we move through time, these rules became even more specific as kingdoms tried to maintain their borders. Imagine you are living in Ireland in the year 1366. The English crown is worried. They are terrified that the English settlers living in Ireland are becoming too much like the Irish. They are wearing Irish clothes, speaking the Irish language, and, most dangerously, growing Irish mustaches. The English government passes the Statute of Kilkenny. It is a set of laws designed to keep the two cultures separate. One of the most famous clauses dictates exactly how a man must groom his upper lip. To be English was to be clean-shaven on the upper lip. To grow a thick mustache, known as a cromwell, was to identify as Irish. If you were an English settler and you grew that mustache, you were legally declaring yourself an enemy of the crown. You were literally wearing your treason on your face. The law forced men to choose a side with a razor. You could not be both. You had to look the part of a loyal subject, or you would face the consequences of being an outsider. This obsession with grooming as a form of identification even extended to the highest reaches of power. Consider the Merovingian kings of the Frankish Empire. They were known as the long-haired kings. To them, their hair was not just a symbol of royalty, it was the source of their right to rule. If a rival wanted to depose a Merovingian king without killing him, they wouldn't just take his crown. They would drag him into a public square and cut his hair. In that one act, the king was legally and spiritually disqualified from the throne. He was transformed from a divinely chosen leader into a commoner. There are stories of queens who, when told their sons must either be killed or shorn, replied that they would rather see them dead than deprived of their hair. To live without the hair was to live without the soul of their status. You might wonder why they didn't just let people wear whatever they wanted. But you have to remember that a medieval city was a place of high tension and low information. When you walk down a narrow, crowded street in Paris or London, you need to know who is a priest, who is a soldier, who is a foreigner, and who is a nobleman. Since they didn't have ID cards in their pockets, they wore their ID on their chins and their scalps. These grooming regulations were the facial recognition software of the Middle Ages. They were a way to bring order to a chaotic world. They ensured that in the middle of a riot, a battle, or a busy market day, you could look at a person and know exactly where they fit into the great chain of being. So, the next time you look in the mirror and decide whether to trim your beard or let your hair grow long, remember that you are exercising a freedom that your ancestors would have found staggering. To them, a haircut was never just a haircut. It was a declaration of war, a vow of poverty, or a claim to a throne. In the world of blades and beards, your life could very well depend on the edge of a razor. The rules were weird, yes, but in a world where a stranger was a potential threat and a neighbor was your only shield, they were the only things keeping the social fabric from fraying into total anarchy. You would have followed these rules, too. You would have shaved your neck before the battle and kept your mustache trimmed to prove your loyalty. Because in the Middle Ages, the way you groomed your head wasn't about who you wanted to be. It was about proving to everyone else who you actually were. Imagine you are standing on a windswept ridge in the deep, shadowed forests of 10th century Germany, or perhaps the rugged highlands of medieval Scotland. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and with its departure, the world has transformed into a cold, predatory place. You are miles from your own village. Your horse is tired. Your boots are soaked through with freezing mud, and you can no longer see the path beneath your feet. In this era, there are no neon signs pointing the way to a roadside motel. There are no maps in your pocket. To be caught outside after dark in the medieval world is often a death sentence, whether delivered by the biting frost, the wolves howling in the distance, or the desperate men who haunt the fringes of society. You see a flicker of light through the trees. It is a humble farmhouse, a long house with smoke curling from a hole in the thatch roof. You approach the door and knock. In our modern world, the person inside might look through a peephole and call the police. They might ignore you or tell you to move on. But in the medieval world, the moment you knock on that door, a complex, ancient, and strictly enforced legal machine begins to turn. You are no longer just a cold stranger. You are a guest. And in many parts of Europe and the British Isles, that host is legally, religiously, and socially mandated to let you in. This was the law of mandatory hospitality. It sounds like a charming tradition or a quaint suggestion of being neighborly, but make no mistake, it was one of the most serious and rigid rules of the Middle Ages. It existed for a very good reason. In a world without a centralized government to build infrastructure, without a police force to patrol the roads, and without a commercial hospitality industry to house travelers, the entire system of human movement depended on the forced kindness of strangers. If people did not open their doors, the wheels of trade, the flow of news, and the survival of the poor would have ground to a halt. To understand why this was so strictly enforced, you have to look at the landscape you are walking through. In the early and high Middle Ages, the vast majority of the population lived in isolated rural pockets. Travel was incredibly dangerous and rare. If you were on the road, you were likely a merchant, a pilgrim, a messenger, or a displaced laborer. Because there were so few inns, and the ones that did exist were often located only in major trading hubs or near cathedrals, the average traveler relied entirely on the domestic hearths of the peasantry and the nobility. The laws surrounding this were surprisingly specific. In medieval Wales, for example, the laws of Hywel Dda were very clear about the rights of the traveler. If you were a person of certain standing, a host was required to provide you with a specific amount of food and a place to sleep. If they refused you, they could be fined. In ancient Irish Brehon law, the system was even more sophisticated. There was a specific office called a brughaid, a public hospitaller. These were wealthy landowners who were given high social status specifically because they were required to keep their doors open 24 hours a day to anyone who passed by. Their house had to be located at a crossroads, and they were required to have a certain amount of livestock and grain on hand at all times to feed any stranger who walked through the door. If a brughaid failed to provide hospitality, they lost their status and their legal standing in the community. But why would a poor farmer want to let a stranger into their home? You have to remember the physical reality of a medieval house. It is usually one large room. The family sleeps together on one side, and the animals are often kept on the other. Bringing in a stranger meant giving up a portion of your very limited food and sharing your most private, vulnerable space. To ensure this happened, the law didn't just punish the host who refused. It also protected the host from the guest. This is where the concept of the peace of the hearth comes in. When you step across that threshold, you enter into a sacred contract. You are given protection, food, and shelter. In return, you owe the host your absolute loyalty for the duration of your stay. In many Germanic and Scandinavian cultures, the rules were ironclad. If you were a guest in a man's house, you could not harm him, his family, or his property. If you committed a crime against your host, the punishment was far more severe than if you had committed that same crime against a stranger on the road. It was seen as a betrayal of the highest order, a violation of the laws of nature and God. The host, too, was under a heavy burden of responsibility. If someone was a guest in your home and they were attacked or robbed while under your roof, you were legally liable. You had failed in your duty of protection. In some jurisdictions, if a guest died in your house, you had to prove that you had nothing to do with it, and in some cases, you were even responsible for their burial and the notification of their kin. You might wonder how this stayed sustainable. How did people not just take advantage of this? The answer lies in the ritual. When you arrived at a house, there was a specific etiquette to be followed. You would usually leave your weapons at the door or hand them to the host. You might be offered water to wash your feet, a gesture of both comfort and a way for the host to see that you were not hiding anything. The breaking of bread was the physical manifestation of the contract. Once you had eaten the host's salt and bread, you were bound to them. This mandatory hospitality acted as the social grease for the entire medieval economy. think about the king or a high-ranking lord. They did not stay in one place. They moved from estate to estate, often with hundreds of followers. This was called the right of purveyance or the right of guest. A lord had the legal right to demand food and lodging from his subjects as he traveled. While this could be a massive burden on a village, it was also the primary way the king stayed in touch with his kingdom. It was how taxes were essentially collected in a world without much liquid currency. The king and his court would literally eat the tax revenue of a region by staying there for a few weeks. But for you, the lonely traveler, the rule was about something much more fundamental. It was about the fact that tomorrow the roles could be reversed. The farmer who lets you in today might be the man searching for a lost cow in the next valley next week. He might be caught in a storm and need to knock on your brother's door. In a world where everyone was vulnerable, hospitality was a form of mutual insurance. There was also a deeply ingrained religious element that kept people from slamming the door. In the Christian tradition, there was the constant reminder that you should entertain strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels unawares. In the Norse tradition, the god Odin was said to wander the world disguised as a weary traveler in a blue cloak, testing the hospitality of mortals. If you were cruel to a beggar, you might be offending a god or a saint. This fear of divine retribution was a powerful motivator in a society where people truly believed that the supernatural was just a heartbeat away. As you sit by the fire in the stranger's house, you realize that this rule created a strange kind of temporary peace. Even if the man across the fire is from a rival clan or a village your people have quarreled with, the law of the unbroken bread stands between you. For tonight, the feud is paused. The hospitality rules created a neutral space in a world that was often at war with itself. It allowed for the exchange of ideas, the telling of stories from distant lands, and the simple human connection that prevented isolated communities from becoming completely insular and xenophobic. Eventually, as the Middle Ages progressed, this system began to change. The rise of a more robust money economy led to the creation of more professional inns. The growth of cities meant that people could find lodging for a fee rather than relying on a social contract. But the DNA of mandatory hospitality never truly vanished. It morphed into our modern ideas of the rights of the traveler and the duties of the host. When you finally leave that farmhouse the next morning, you have survived the night because of a rule that many today would find intrusive or weird. But to you, standing in the cold morning air and looking back at the smoke rising from the chimney, that rule was the only thing that kept you alive. It was the understanding that in a harsh world, the door must remain unlocked, and the bread must be shared, because the stranger at the gate is simply a version of yourself that hasn't found home yet. This was not just a law of the land. It was the law of human survival, etched into the very stones of every hearth from the fjords of the north to the sun-drenched hills of the south. You stand at the threshold of a world that feels fundamentally alien. You are standing in the center of a 14th century village square. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pungent tang of livestock. To your modern eyes, this place looks like a chaotic mess of superstition and arbitrary cruelty. You see people being dragged to cold ponds for trials of water, or you hear of laws that dictate exactly how many inches of silk a merchant can wear. It is easy, from your vantage point in the 21st century, to look back and scoff. It is easy to label these people as primitive or irrational. But as you walk through these muddy streets, you must shed that arrogance. You have to realize that every strange rule, every bizarre custom, and every seemingly nonsensical law was a brick in a wall built to keep out the ultimate enemy of the medieval world: chaos. You hear a sudden, piercing shout. It is not a cry of pain. but a specific, rhythmic yell that echoes off the timber-framed houses. Someone has just seen a thief snatch a purse from a stall. Immediately, the world around you transforms. The blacksmith drops his hammer with a heavy clang. The baker leaves his oven. The weaver steps away from her loom. They all begin to run toward the sound, echoing the cry themselves. This is the hue and cry. To you, it might look like a wild mob, but it is actually a strictly enforced legal requirement. If you heard that cry and stayed in your shop, you would be hauled before a judge and fined. You were legally obligated to join the chase. Why? Because in your world, you can dial 3 numbers on a piece of glass in your pocket and a professional armed force will arrive in minutes. In the medieval world, there is no police force. There is no standing army patrolling the streets. Security is not a service you pay for with taxes. It is a duty you owe to your neighbor. The hue and cry was a remarkably efficient system of communal policing. It turned every single citizen into a deputy. It ensured that a criminal could not simply vanish into the shadows, because the shadows themselves were filled with eyes and ears that were legally bound to catch them. It was not about vigilantism. It was about the realization that in a world without professional law enforcement, the only thing standing between you and total lawlessness was the person standing next to you. As the commotion of the chase fades into the distance, you notice a man being escorted toward the church. He is a merchant, a man of some means, but he looks terrified. He has been accused of a crime, and today he must face the trial by ordeal. You watch as a priest blesses a heavy piece of iron that has been heating in a brazier until it glows a dull, angry red. The merchant is told he must pick up that iron, carry it 3 paces, and then drop it. His hand will be bandaged, and 3 days later, if the wound is healing cleanly, he is innocent. If it is festering, he is guilty and will likely face the gallows. To you, this is the height of medieval madness. How can a physical burn determine a moral truth? But look closer at the faces in the crowd and the whispers of the priest. Modern historians and economists have looked at the records of these trials and found something startling. The innocent were acquitted at an incredibly high rate. The trial by ordeal was not actually a test of physics. It was a test of faith and psychology. In a society where everyone truly believed that God would intervene to show the truth, a guilty man would often confess before touching the iron to save his soul from eternal damnation. An innocent man, certain that a miracle would protect him, would walk forward with a calm heart and a steady hand. The priests, who were often much more observant than we give them credit for, could manipulate the heat of the iron or the duration of the contact based on their own assessment of the accused person's character and the community's consensus. It was a high-stakes theater designed to resolve disputes that had no witnesses, using the one thing everyone in the village shared: a terrifyingly real belief in the divine. You move away from the church and toward the marketplace, where you see a woman being berated by an official. He is pointing at her dress. She is the wife of a wealthy tanner, and she is wearing a gown of deep violet silk with long, trailing sleeves. To you, she looks elegant. To the law, she is a criminal. These are the sumptuary laws, rules that dictate what you can wear based on your social rank. You might think this is just the ruling class being snobs, trying to keep the poor in their place. And while there is some truth to that, the logic runs much deeper. In your time, you have identification cards, passports, and digital footprints. You know who someone is because of a database. In the medieval world, there are no databases. Your clothing is your identity card. It tells the world exactly who you are, what your creditworthiness is, and what level of authority you hold. If a merchant's wife can dress like a duchess, the entire social and economic signaling system breaks down. A merchant might be given credit he cannot repay because he looks like a nobleman. A commoner might be given a position of trust he hasn't earned. These laws were a way of maintaining an observable, physical order in a world where appearances were the only data points available. They were also a form of protectionism, designed to ensure that people spent their money on local goods rather than draining the local economy to buy luxury fabrics from abroad. As evening begins to fall, a heavy, resonant bell begins to toll from the town tower. You see people immediately stop what they are doing. In every house, you see the orange glow of the hearths being smothered with ash or covered with a metal lid. This is the curfew. The word itself comes from the French phrase couvre-feu, which literally means cover fire. You might think of a curfew as a way for a tyrannical government to keep people off the streets, but in the Middle Ages it was a vital safety regulation. Think about the world you are standing in. The houses are made of timber and wattle and daub. The roofs are thatched with dry straw. The floors are covered in rushes. Every single house has an open flame burning in the center of the room. If one person falls asleep and a log rolls out of the hearth, the entire street will be an inferno within minutes. There are no fire trucks. There are no high-pressure hoses. A fire in a medieval city is a death sentence for hundreds, if not thousands, of people. The curfew bell was the community's collective heartbeat, a nightly reminder that your private warmth could become everyone's public destruction. By forcing everyone to extinguish their fires at the same time, the town ensured that the hours of darkness, when people were least alert, were also the hours of greatest safety. You realize now that these rules were not about being weird or cruel. They were about the fragility of life. When you live on the razor's edge of survival, you cannot afford the luxury of modern individualism. Every rule you have encountered today is a way of tying people together, of making the individual responsible for the whole. The hue and cry tied your safety to your neighbor's legs. The trial by ordeal tied your justice to your neighbor's faith. The sumptuary laws tied your identity to your neighbor's expectations. And the curfew tied your very life to your neighbor's hearth. The shadows in this village are long, and the nights are very dark, but the logic that governs this world is as bright as a torch. These people were not living in a fog of ignorance. They were navigating a dangerous world with the tools they had. They traded a little bit of personal freedom for a lot of communal security. As you prepare to leave this place and return to the comfort of your own century, take one last look at the village. The rules that seemed so strange at first now look like the skeletal structure of a society that refused to collapse. It was a world held together by invisible threads of duty and shared risk. A world where the law was not just something written in a book, but a living, breathing necessity that kept the darkness at bay. You leave the medieval square not with pity, but with a new understanding of what it takes to build a civilization from the mud up. The shadows are rational, and the logic of the Dark Ages is, in its own way, perfectly clear.